One, everything is fake. Not only the resume of the Forrest Gump of the presidency, the most interesting man in the world, Joe Biden, but everything is fake from the set to the followers to the support on OnlyFans. Two, does Black America, for that matter, does any of America want a daddy? Do they want a Momala? We'll break that down. And what is the Hotep movement within Black America with Hotep Jesus? And three, a rebuttal to our conversation with David Sachs over the war in Ukraine with Rebeccah Heinrichs. It is the Will Cain Show, streaming live at foxnews.com, on the Fox News YouTube channel and the Fox News Facebook page. Always on demand by subscribing at Apple or on Spotify, or subscribe in the text link underneath this live stream on YouTube to the Will Cain Show. You can watch the highlights, the interviews, the YouTube shorts by subscribing on YouTube right here with the button for the Will Cain Show. We've got a big show today. We're going to be breaking down the debate we had with the Devil's Advocacy I played last week with David Sachs, noted skeptic of the war in Ukraine. That interview received a lot of criticism. One of those critics of the Hudson Institute, Rebeccah Heinrichs, will be joining us just a little bit later here on the Will Cain Show because we intend to have an open forum for debate. We intend to be a home for critical thinking. We intend to be authentic. We intend to be real, which brings us to story number one. Everything is fake. Nothing is real. Earlier this week on a podcast hosted by Richard Hanania, an OnlyFans celebrity, an OnlyFans influencer named Farha Khalidi, in talking about how she made money on OnlyFans, talked about the way she built up her follower account, her subscriber base, while she was still in college, and the different ads she took. And almost in an offhanded comment, she talked about taking advertisements, paid influencing programs from the White House. Listen.
TikTok was basically full-time for me. I think I was taking ads by the time I graduated college from like the Biden administration and Planned Parenthood and like dating apps and stuff. So it was like fully financially, sustaining
So you were
me.
getting, the Biden administration was buying ads from you?
Yeah, I was doing full-on political propaganda.
And they would just, really? With like what kind of, like Biden created 10 million jobs this year?
Yeah, honestly. And the funny thing is they're like, do not disclose this is an ad because, they're like, technically it's not a product. So you don't have to disclose it's an ad. Because I think they just wanted like some edgy girl of color to just tell people, like when they nominated like Ketanji Brown Jackson, they're like, can you say like as a person of color, that you feel reflected? And it's like a white woman emailing this to me, and she's like giving me this script, and I'm like, no. And she's like, please. And I'm like, no, I'll like talk about the news of it, but I'm not gonna have a white person tell me to be like, this is how I feel as a person of color. Like, it's just so, I think that black-pilled me slightly on like, political propaganda stuff.
So the Biden administration sees, here's this young,
yeah, I mean, they use like a conduit. It's not like, you know what I mean? It's not Biden, but it's like a third party. You know what I mean? It's like a media company.
Yeah.
A media company paying her to talk about how great it was that Biden had nominated Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. That's courtesy of the Richard Hanania podcast. Everything just feels so manipulated. Everything is so fake. What is real? There's reports that show that much of the follower accounts for Joe Biden on various social media platforms are fake. And maybe that puts him in common company. Maybe that's not just every celebrity, but that's every politician who has some type of inflated influence by buying followers and subscribers. And whenever I talk about something involving Joe Biden, not only do I feel like you get some inevitable pushback, but there are little antennas that go up in my head that say, listen, isn't this par for the course? Don't all politicians lie? And of course, again, I think that is par for the course. I think the king of lies, by the way, is Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. But the antenna that should go up, the bit of self-awareness you always have to consider, is the constant refrain of, what about Trump? Well, listen, I don't think Trump is a bastion of virtue where you will only and always ever get the truth. Do I think Trump indulges in embellishment? Absolutely. I think if he caught a 10-pound bass. Before the story was over, it would be a 20-pound bass. I think that, he's got probably a record number of holes in ones in golf championships. But, as Bill Maher once said when talking about Trump versus Hillary Clinton, in the end, much of America prefers the obvious and shallow lies over the calculated, polished, and perfected deep lies. I think that was a perfect way to describe the difference between the lies of Hillary Clinton and the lies of Donald Trump. When it comes to Joe Biden, from every issue over the past, certainly during his presidency, but even before his presidency, extending into the mid-2010s, everything felt so manufactured. Every story, every bit of concern trolling, every divisive issue feels like it was concocted around a boardroom table at an ad agency employed by the White House. Everything feels so fake. Yesterday here on the Will Cain Show, we went over the fake resume from Greek, Irish, Italian, Polish, Jewish synagogue, raised in a black church ethnic resume, to driving an 18-wheeler, hiking the Himalayas, arrested in South Africa, holding football records, and graduating at the top of his class in law school. Everything from a noted and documented plagiarist just feels so fake. And so to hear an influencer have her support falsely manufactured just feels part of everything manufactured today in America. It's at a deeper level, though, it's fake support. It's a fake coalition. It's a voting base cobbled together with spit and duct tape, but largely through lies to tell you that you're all on the same page because you have a common enemy. And of course, that fake support, either online or in people's hearts and minds, is hammered home with a pillow by our fake celebrities. You have to hear all of the inauthenticity and just stomach-churning vomit coming yesterday on the Drew Barrymore show. Watch this.
I've been thinking that we really all need a tremendous hug in the world right now. Yeah. But in our country, we need you to be Momala of the country.
We need you to be Momala of the country. I mean, it is vomit-inducing. It's also somewhere short of comedic and unintentional comedy, but it's also just so fake. Like Drew Barrymore's fake concern and fake sincerity. We all don't need a hug right now. And we sure as high hell don't need a Momala. Howard Stern, who used to fashion himself as a rebel, told Joe Biden that he was so proud to consider him now the father of the country. We don't have daddy issues. We as a country aren't looking to solve a single-parent home. We're not looking for surrogate parents. We're looking for a leader. Now, I don't know if the left is looking to replace broken homes or mommy and daddy issues by finding someone who can give them a hug, tell them it's all going to be okay, and provide them a safe space and some chocolate milk. I don't know if the left is looking for that when they vote for president. But as a country, I can assure you, I don't need the president to be my daddy, and I don't need the vice president to be my Momala. And if that's the place that you found yourself, you need to start considering maybe it's not your opponents who are in a cult, but maybe you have fallen into a cult. Maybe you are looking for someone to give you everything you need in life, to forgive your student loans, to provide you free health care, to pretend like your education is supposed to be a moment where you never hear hard questions, but only have someone tell you, that's right, you're the best. Maybe you're trying to create perpetual childhood and never grow up. We're not looking for a Momala and we're not looking for a father. We're looking for a leader. And in order to find a leader, we need to find what is real. We're not going to be able to do it through this completely manufactured reality where everything from resumes to issues is 100% completely fake. Let's get into this in just a moment here on the Will Cain Show. We'll talk about whether or not Black America, much less the rest of America, need a daddy and a momala. We're going to break that down. Plus, what is the Hotep movement within Black America with Hotep Jesus next on the Will Cain Show.
Get all of your favorite Fox News podcasts commercial-free on Apple Podcasts with Fox News Podcasts Plus. From Dana Perino, Kennedy, Ben Domenech, The Duffys, and many more. Subscribe now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. The Fox News Rundown, a contrast of perspectives you won't hear anywhere else. Your daily dose of news twice a day, featuring insight from top newsmakers, reporters, and Fox News contributors. Listen and subscribe now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. Did you hear the news? Now you can. With instant updates from Fox News for Amazon Alexa. Breaking stories and top headlines, the economy, and so much more. Brought to you by Fox News, America's #1 cable news network. Plus, setup couldn't be easier because everything's ready to go in the app. Just say,
Alexa, play news from Fox.
In Fox News.
It's the latest when you need it, on demand, from Fox News and Amazon Alexa. Stay on top of the latest forecast with America's Weather Team in the palm of your hands.
Here's the latest from America's Weather Center.
It's Fox weather updates throughout your busy day, every day.
That heat's going to be out there for one more day.
Temperatures being 30 degrees above average.
Put the power of over 100 meteorologists and the worldwide resources of Fox in your hands with the Fox Weather Podcast. Precise, personal, powerful. Subscribe and listen now at foxnewspodcasts.com.
Losing Black America? Has Joe Biden, have the Democrats lost Black America? That's next on the Will Cain Show. Streaming live at foxnews.com, on the Fox News YouTube channel, the Fox News Facebook page, and just hit subscribe as you're listening or watching right now at Apple or on Spotify or on YouTube. What is the Hotep movement in Black America? Let's get into that with story number 2. He is the host of the Grift Report. He's the author of the Patriot Report. He's on X at Hotep Jesus. He's been a guest on Gutfeld and many other programs like Joe Rogan. He is Hotep Jesus, and he's now on the Will Cain Show. What's up? What's up?
What's up, Will? Thanks for having me, bro. How's everything?
It's good, but as we go through this conversation, should I say, what's up, Hotep? Should I say, what's up, Brian? Should I say, what's up, Jesus? Which will be awkward. But which would
Hotep.
how would you prefer me to refer to you?
Call me Hotep.
What is Hotep?
Hotep. What is Hotep? Hotep is ancient Medunetta. This is ancient language stemming from ancient Kemet, or some might call it ancient Egypt. And it's a word that means peace or satisfaction. But right around the time that Barack Obama was in office and Black Lives Matter started to explode, there became this takeover, this liberal communist takeover of Black intelligentsia, Black corporate media, Huffington Post coming in and buying out publications like The Root and sort of derailing where Black people were mentally. And at that point, Hotep became a pejorative. And so I was used to the word being seen in great light. And so I wasn't going to have that happen on my watch. So we took the word back and started a movement out of it. So now we're Hotep Nation, hotepnation.com, and we support the homeschooling community.
So I think this is what I assume you're going to take issue with. This is from Urban Dictionary. Hotep, Afrocentric brother, usually insecure, who claims to be woke but actually isn't unless you are straight black men. In a Hotep's eyes, you're responsible for the destruction of the black community. Misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, conspiracy theory aficionado. He will fill your head up with so much pseudoscience and ill-researched historical facts, you'll be ready to bash his head in with a Google search engine. That's Urban Dictionary on Hotep.
That's perfect. That's a perfect definition. I love that definition. The reason why I love that definition is you have to think about the author of that definition, right? And a few things that they pointed out there were, one of them was sexual orientation. The other one was science, right? So we just had a situation where a lot of people went out and got the experimental inoculation. Hoteps have told people for many, many years, if not decades, not to take that inoculation. We stayed away from it. So, you know, they fall in line with Gil Bates and the rest of them, right? George Soros, etc. The other thing is their sexual orientation. Well, what is up with that? You know, there was a time where, you know, in the black community, if you wanted to be pro-black, the only requisite was being black, right? Now it's like, oh, you got to affirm trans people. You have to affirm gay people. So it sort of shows you how the Marxism has came in and started to dominate black intelligentsia, black corporate media. So that definition doesn't bother me. It's perfect because now I get to show people, look, this is what these people are about. They're about something that has nothing to do with black people.
So besides, of course, yourself, like, who would you give us is a great, maybe historical example of what you would say is a leader of the Hotep movement? I mean, I wouldn't profess any level of expertise, but I've, you know, read a little bit about the movement, and it certainly does seem to have an anti-communist bent. It certainly has a self-reliance bent, a self-sustaining to the community bent, you know, a lot of which rings of maybe even Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington. But I don't know that you would claim those particular leaders as the best emblem of the movement. Who would be a great symbol?
Probably Garvey. Marcus Garvey, UNIA.
Marcus Garvey.
Yeah, I mean, Marcus Garvey went to war with the NAACP. A lot of people don't know this, but NAACP, along with W.E.B. Du Bois, you know, these sellout Negroes, basically what they were doing was they wanted to have, they actually got them extradited. They were snitching because they wanted to do things a particular way. In one of his writings, he mentions how he goes into the NAACP office and everyone in there is white passing, right? So the NAACP was this white passing organization run by white passing and white people and really used to control the black mind. You know, it's controlled opposition. It's making sure that black people never practice anything that could render them independent. Instead, it seeks dependence on government, dependence upon, whatever committees they put together, concepts, ideas, but it really doesn't fight for independence and teach independence. An example of that would be integration. People down south didn't want integration. What they wanted was representation of their tax dollars, which they were not getting. NAACP came down there and said, we'll fight for this, but we also want integration. They said, no, we don't want integration. And then you see how terrible integration turned out to be. You look now and the black family's falling apart, black wealth is falling apart, there's no black banks. So the black family was much better off during the pre-civil rights era, pre-integration, from a very economic standpoint, and even culturally as well.
Well, I've seen you talk about this. Okay, first of all, on one level, there's the cancer of victimhood. That's a cancer for both the individual and for a community. If you teach a community or an individual victimhood, and I've seen you say this, you also teach them dependency. You can never arrive at self-sufficiency or even a sense of self-worth if it's always predicated upon someone else providing you that self-sufficiency or that self-worth. But you also said that this movement kind of, in your estimation, started kind of around Barack Obama, where the black intelligentsia became more open to Marxism. And again, I don't hold myself out as an expert, but a little bit of historical understanding. Even dating back to the 50s and the 60s, a lot of that black nationalist movement was behind the scenes organized and funded by the Marxist movements that were spreading the tentacles of the Soviet Union across the globe. Like they were looking to create this idea that black identity is intertwined with Marxism. This seems like something that, while it maybe have become more obvious in the last decade, has been a half a century in the making. Yeah, so you have to delineate between Marxism or economic Marxism and cultural Marxism. What we're dealing with today is more cultural Marxism, where they're trying to disintegrate the culture of the black community and feed it nothing but lechery and now, during the time of, for example, the Black Panther Party, you're dealing with basically a bunch of kids. I call them a bunch of kids. These guys are like 20 years old, right? So you can't really expect too much, intelligence from somebody so young. So, and also at that time, there wasn't that many alternatives, right? It was basically United States of America, and it was communism, right? And it seemed like communism had great appeal. And in many ways, communism does. But what I think it comes back to is communists like to latch on to whoever the marginalized group is, whoever the victim class is. They like to latch on to them. The issue is, and this is where Marx is right, is the bourgeoisie, the middle class, tend to have a hands-off approach to the lower class. And when they act like that, when they act like they're too good, they're going to receive animus from the lower class, right? Now, what happens is, because nobody's speaking to these people, somebody is going to have their ear. At that time, the only people that gave them an ear was communists. They're the only people that said, hey, we know you're struggling, let's talk to you. Had there been opposition to Marxism, then maybe there wouldn't have been Marxism. But at this period, we're talking about, massive racism. For example, the Munn Act, when the Black Panther Party is out in California and they pass anti-gun legislation. This is the Republican Party. This is Reagan, right? So there were many things going on that, sort of, hurt the black community, but only one was speaking to that, and that was Marxism. Today, we have the internet, we have Milton Friedman, we have Soul, we have Walter Williams, we have Rothbard. So there's no excuse to be subject to Marxism, although I think Marx got a lot right. I think what happens with communism is they diagnose the disease, but their prescription is wrong, right? And their diagnosis, I wouldn't say is 100% certain, but it's pretty on point. And that's where we are today, where you have the option to go learn about economics and learn about, how is money created in America and how is our financial system run. And when you start to understand these things, you see how Marxism can't serve you, and capitalism is probably the only means to create any sort of fair competition. And Marxism is going to hinder that because it's going to lend more credence to the government. Right. And I do want to get into some of the politics of today, but I'm too fascinated by this particular part of the conversation. So, like, in your estimation, and I have a response I'm thinking through as you're talking, but in your estimation, what did he get right, Marx? The middle class. The middle class attitude is absolutely atrocious. They look down on the downtrodden. They scoff at them. They actually don't do much to help them. And then what happens is, in capitalism, in the communist practices and policies, the middle class is actually squeezed so much so that they can't help the lower class. For example, what we dealt with during the pandemic, where small business was shut down. So now small business is middle class, but they're barely surviving, so they don't have enough to even hire. Another communist practice or socialist practice is something called minimum wage. And minimum wage makes it so that the middle class can't hire the lower class because they just can't afford to.
But it's usually what I liked about Marx's assessment was the attitude of the middle class. And I see that from anecdotal evidence just within my own family, how they look at poor, how we look at the poor in our own family, how we have a hands-off approach and not a hands-on approach to dealing with the poverty in our own communities. Gentrification not only hurts black people, but also hurts white people. You have rich whites moving out poorer whites in places like Pennsylvania. Do people care about other people? And it seems like once people make it to that middle class, upper middle class, you know, they put their chin up to the sky.
Okay,
and also,
so
Marx talks
there's
about
Marx
the bankers. What's that?
No, I finished that thought.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, okay, there's Marx in theory and Marx in philosophy, and then communism in practice. So my thought as I'm listening to you say that is that a fundamental, this is not an endorsement, it's a diagnosis, that a fundamental condition of humanity is that the merely poor want to be separated from the very poor, and the middle class want to be separated from the merely poor. And the above average income want to be separated from the middle class. And the merely rich want to be separated from the above average middle class. And the truly wealthy want to be separated from the merely rich. It truly is that is just sort of some fundamental condition of humanity. We can dive deeply into why that might be the case. But it really crosses race, it crosses culture, it spans the globe. Now, that's not endorsement, again, that's a diagnosis. Now, Marx understanding that and seeing that is sort of like step one. Step two is whether or not there's any governmental mechanism that can correct that. And I think that after, a century of practice, we've seen that communism is a failed exercise in trying to alleviate that human condition. All it really is pointing out a division in society to place another group of elite at the top who is your savior, who is your statist, who can solve all of your problems. And that's just a failed experiment. And so the question is, well, if we want to try to address the lower class, and I agree with you, that's a problem we should. We want to try to help fellow man. The only real solution, or the best we've come to any real solution, is empathy. It is volunteerism. It's through human beings connecting as human beings and saying, through my charity or my time or through my heart, I volunteer to help you. Not because it's been commandeered by the government, not because there's some big program that's proven to be successful, but ultimately you have to impress upon the better angels of humans.
Yeah, I totally agree. Government's role, though, is about removing some of the regulations. Like I said, as long as minimum wage exists, it's only going to exasperate the problem. I mean, you go look at the story of Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell's another person, another soul, no pun intended, that started out as a socialist. And how does his story go? His story goes, he joins the Department of Labor, Washington, D.C., right in the middle of the swamp. And he's like, I want to try and tackle this minimum wage thing. So he does a whole bunch of research. He comes back with the data and he finds a solution to the problem, or he's asking questions about the problem. And when he asked those questions, they didn't want to give him the data to those questions, because if they did, you'd find out what the true problem is. And he was like, that's when he realized he was following the wrong doctrine of socialism and that government is not the answer to these things. So, the more they raise minimum wage, the more they're going to alienate the middle class, and the greater the lower class is going to become. Communism in practice just does not work. It only works within your household or small communities.
Exactly. Within small communities or within your household. That's so wonderfully well put. So that brings me to this. I've seen some of what you guys have said. I think you put out a video like Hotepistan. And, you talk a lot about, like, we got to build black businesses. We in the black community, we got to build black businesses. We got to build an internal community of support to build the foundations of wealth and success in society. And you can look at other communities, ethnic communities, racial communities, who have done that. I'm curious, like, are you a black separatist? I'm not suggesting that description of what you might idealize is black separatism, but I do think that someone that was listening who's like inclined to think that way would wonder, hey, are you talking about black separatism?
Okay, yeah. So let's deal with that. So in Hotep Nation, there are many white members. So we just did a show called the Grifties. This is our yearly award show. Our program director is white. Our video director is white. In fact, we did it because of our video director. We had Sam Tripoli on that stage.
So you have white friends?
Shane Cashman, Chrissy Mayer. I'm not a black separatist, right? Like, even Chrissy Mayer has gotten backlash to some of the things she said, right? I don't really care about race. What I'm saying is I'm dealing in reality, okay? And if we were to deal with this thing at a very simplistic level, you have Nation A, you have Nation B, right? Nation A has X amount of resources and Nation B has X amount of resources. There's going to be some exchange there. And if there's not a fair and even exchange, then something is going to go wrong, okay? So if this nation is dependent upon this nation for sustenance, let's say it's grain or whatever, and there's no two-way situation, well, what happens when you're the dependent in a situation? Look at a child and father relationship, child and parent relationship. If they're the dependent, then you have to follow the rules of the master, right? Look at the relationship between America and China. We can't really do too much with China because 90% of the goods in Walmart come from China. Our microchips and all this other stuff comes from, right? So when you're dealing in trying to create power, independence, freedom, you have to look at economics. So when I saw black people complaining, Black Lives Matter and all this other stuff, I'm like, well, the first thing we need to do is we need to check our GDP and our GNP of black people and then decide, what's the next move. For example, the other day I saw somebody complaining because they're dealing with hair care products in a beauty supply store, and they're saying that Chinese people won't sell to them, or they sell to them at higher prices, marginalizing them and basically, kicking them out of the industry. And this is why black hair beauty supply stores always go out of business, because they can't keep up with the Chinese, because the Chinese control manufacturing and distribution. So this is something I tell people, this is basic economics. Who manufactures the goods and who handles the distribution? The same thing in the music industry. You have people complain about the music industry, but who handles the distribution, right? So if you're not looking at, from farm to table, so to speak, then you're not really understanding the situation. And you can see how black people have been behind the eight ball. And that's why integration has killed us, because we had our own banks, we had our own farms. And now today, it's just not that. So the core of human civilization is about economics. What are you producing? What are you exporting? What are you importing? This has nothing really to do with race, just has everything to do with just basic functions of humanity.
I keep thinking I want to transition to ask you about the conversation I led today with the Will Cain Show, Joe Biden, but I have to just keep following my own curiosity based upon what you say. So you tweeted this, which I found fascinating. You said, "There's no such thing as a black or a white people. These terms erase the memories of African or European lineage. Then the juxtaposition creates division, war. Know thyself." So, I mean, I think I totally get what you're saying there. Like this superficial manufactured coalition of people, right? Oh, you're black, I'm white. It's both a false divider and a false unifier, right? At the same time. It's like, I don't know if that's what you're saying, but you also are talking about unifying black America in a self-sustaining way. I assume what you're talking about there is like, whatever your ethnic heritage, black is part of it. West African, North African, East African, whatever mine is, white is only a superficial descriptor of, Scotch, Irish, whatever it may be, tracing me back to my lineage. And now we've divided this society based on these things that are really cosmetic.
Yeah. So let's look at the nation where it is today, right? Absolute mess. Everybody's complaining, drag queen story hour, all this stuff, right? So what happens is we've lost our way. Now, when you go by the term white and I go by the term black, how far back can we retrace our steps? Because if you're trying to figure out where we went wrong, you have to retrace your steps. So if we're talking about black and white, that stops somewhere. But if you say, yo, I'm Irish and I'm Italian, well, we can trace those back really far all the way into Europe, and we can begin to study who we are and how we acted. With African people, we can trace that back. Oh, I'm from Africa. But, well, what were the customs and how did we deal with our problems? Ba, 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 ba. So it's about understanding tradition. And I think today where we are, it's time to go back. You know, we've gone awry somewhere. It's time to go backwards. And when you're dealing with black and white, you erase memories. And that's really what this is designed to do. It's designed to erase the memories of African and European peoples. And it also, what it also does is it wants to create homogeneity of minds, right? Because then the communist system can insert their mind virus easier. Like, we can just inject this thing into all white people. But if you said, yo, I'm Italian and I'm Irish and I'm French and I'm German, well, they have to take time to reconstruct the mind virus for all these different cultures, right? And then once you create that homogeneity of whiteness and that homogeneity of blackness, now you can put those two things at odds and create this divide and conquer type situation.
But at this point, I'm curious, at this point in America, what would you say to the idea that there is a distinct African-American culture now separated from whatever historical origins got us to this point? So, you know, I was in sports for a long time, and this is not just in sports, but it's something you hear a lot in sports, you know, for the culture, right? For the culture. And I've actually seen you say this as well, where you've talked about black conservatives, and you've kind of said, you know, black conservatives are pretty far removed from black culture. So even though you're advocating for this deeper understanding of who we are as kind of as individuals, although also kind of understanding as individuals where we fit into these historical tribes, you are at the same time acknowledging a culture of African Americans. And you know, I don't know what your response would be to that, because you've said that many black conservatives are too far removed from that culture, and you have others that say, you know, constantly for the culture.
Yeah, so you can take the microscope and you can zoom in or zoom out however you want. I mean, if you were to take the microscope and zoom all the way in, you know, we're talking about what is the culture of Hotep Jesus as a man born in New Jersey, right? Like, New Jersey has its own culture. I'm from Central Jersey. Central Jersey has a different culture from South Jersey, right? So we can zoom in and zoom out as much as we want. But when we're dealing with blanket terms like black and white, that's zooming out, right? So it's like, okay, if you want to zoom out, let's zoom out. What is black and what is white? Really, what you're doing is you're replacing European with white, and you're replacing African with black. And that's a very 1984 thing to do, right? Where they like to swap words out on, you know, Orwellian, you know, type situation happening here. And this is erasing memory. And that's what they're trying to erase your memory so you can't remember who you are. So, and then what happens is when you can't remember who you are, you don't have an identity. So now you're walking around without an identity, looking for one. And now you have so-called Europeans running around calling themselves so-called white people. And what is a white people? There is no such thing as a white people. So you're just the wandering lost. And that's why the country looks the way it does, because people don't know who they are. Black people, you know, you say we have this thing for the culture because we are searching for an identity. And we can't find our identity because our memory has been erased.
Oh, that's really, really fascinating. So I want to get your thoughts on this statement. It's not a statement. It's really kind of how I have viewed race relations, Hotep. I've always thought, okay, the idea of colorblindness is ridiculous. Nobody can be truly colorblind. So not only, to your point, do you acknowledge who you are, you acknowledge who other people are. And we don't pretend that there are no differences. We acknowledge each other's differences. Now, the goal should be, you know, not in just the modern day DEI sense of celebrate our differences, but I mean, that was kind of the cool thing about the idea of America. Like, we were going to take the best from every culture and incorporate it into this melting pot. But we're also going to identify and reject the worst from these cultures. So that acknowledges a level of cultural color acknowledgement. And then on the individual ethnic level, we just acknowledging reality that we all see each other's differences. But then once we do that, and maybe that ties into your idea of our memories, this is the part that I've always held in high esteem. What we try to do after that acknowledgement is not leave them behind, not forget, but move beyond into seeing each other as individuals. Because whatever those memories are or superficial differences, I don't know how much of the pie graph they make up of us, but I don't think it's the majority, because you're still a dude. I'm a guy. We are still going to have our commonalities. Maybe it's sports, maybe it's music, maybe it's our values, maybe it's the way we treat our families, and we're going to have our differences. And those are much a bigger part on an individual level of how we should go about, interacting with each other as Americans.
Yeah, so I want to refine what you said. You said after we recognize our differences, we move forward, but there's an intermediate step there. The intermediate step is sharing the culture, right? When we look at the culture in the Black community of tap dancing, that has Irish origins. When we look at jump rope in the Black community, something called double Dutch, that actually comes from the Dutch. So there are European pieces of culture that has been shared with the African body, and at some point this is proof of cooperation. The other thing that is proof of cooperation is disintegration. What do they call it? Segregation. Segregation is proof of so-called Black and white cooperation. Because if Black and white people naturally separated, you wouldn't need to legislate segregation. They legislated segregation because we were cooperating, because I recognized your culture, you recognized mine, and I said, well, here's how we cook our pie. And you said, well, here's how we cook our pie. Here's how we dance. Here's how we dance. And then through these things, we create new cultures that is an amalgamation of both of our cultures, right? Which borns a new thing, right? And that's what America was supposed to be about. But instead, what we get is government hopping in and creating division.
All right, I led into this conversation with Joe Biden and the Black vote as a pretext. We ended up saving it for the very end because, to be honest, everything was much more interesting to me. But does Black America, in your estimation, want a Momala? Do they? That's on one level, and I have imagine how you're going to spike that volleyball. But is Black America? I want to ask this on two levels. Is Black America abandoning Joe Biden? But that would be something particular to Joe Biden. Do you think there's a movement of Black America actually abandoning Democrats?
Oh, yes and no, right? Because, again, like, Black America is not homogenous, right? What I like to do is I like to break it up into segments. So what you're talking about is the Black voting block, right? And the Black voting block skews older and female. Now, are segments of the Black voter block leaving the Democratic Party? Yes. But Black people in general have a huge distrust of government to where we don't participate in politics, right? Like, I don't vote because I don't want to participate in a garbage government, right? So I'm part of that demographic that's like, yo, Democrats, Republicans, they're pretty much the same to me. They're both communists at the end of the day, right? So we generally don't deal in politics. So I can't say the Black community is walking away from the Democratic Party. What I can say, of those who are voting this year and have voted in the past, we are walking away from Joe Biden and voting Democrat. I think what it is we're held ransom. This is the biggest racial or racist, systemic racist problem in America is Black people are held ransom, bro. by the Democratic Party. Like some people say it's a Democratic plantation. No, it's a prison. We are locked in, because if I don't agree with those politics, guess what? I can't take care of my family because I can't get a job. If I speak out against this, I lose my endorsements. Think about all of the entertainers, whether they're actors or musicians, that are silent because they are afraid to lose their livelihood. We are held ransom by the Democratic vote, and only those who have achieved ultimate wealth have the ability to have an independent voice. The other thing is they have such a stronghold over black media now. Remember that black media takeover I was telling you about, that they'll have your own people looking at you like you're the enemy. Malcolm X talks about that, how the media make the hero look like the villain and the villain look like the hero. So not only will you be canceled by the corporations, you'll be canceled by your own people, because the perception is if you vote for Trump or you don't look at Democrats, then you're some sort of sellout. So currently we're in like a psychological prison, a physical prison, a financial prison, and we're being held ransom. And I just want to know what the cost is so we can get out of it.
What a fascinating conversation, man. This is the first time we've got to speak. I've seen you a few times, both on various platforms and on Fox News, but I really appreciate this. I hope we can do it again. I've loved this conversation. Hotep Jesus.
Great questions. Some people ask me terrible questions. Those are great questions. Great conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Hotep. There he goes. Hotep Jesus. Again, you can check him out on X, Hotep Jesus. He also hosts the Grift Report, and he's the author of the Patriot Report. All right, coming up, last week we had this conversation with David Sachs, skeptic of the war in Ukraine. It received a lot of pushback. One of the people that gave us pushback was Rebeccah Heinrichs of the Hudson Institute. So, coming up in just a moment will be Rebeccah Heinrichs of the Hudson Institute on Ukraine.
It's time to take the quiz.
5 questions, 5 minutes a day, 5 days a week.
History, pop culture, science, sports, civics. How much do you know? Let's find out.
Who was the first person to walk on the moon?
Jackson or something?
Neil Armstrong.
Take the quiz every weekday at thequiz.fox and then listen to the quiz podcast to find out how you did.
Play, share, and of course listen to the quiz right now at thequiz.fox.
The XFL and the USFL merged together to create one powerful spring football league called the UFL. These players are going to play hard-nosed, intense football, passionate football. They're going to ball out.
Week 6 of the United Football League. The Houston Roughnecks take on A.J. McCarron and the St. Louis Battlehawks. Saturday, 3 Eastern on Fox.
Kick it off, baby. Let's rock.
From the Fox News Podcast Network.
I'm Emily Campagno, and this is the Fox True Crime Podcast.
And I had nothing to do with her disappearance, but people still accuse me of it.
I sit down with the people who lived the nightmares.
I was in shock. I was just devastated.
The investigators who tirelessly worked on the case.
I feel for their families, and I really hope that they can catch this guy.
Bringing you closer to the story than you ever thought possible.
Listen and follow now at foxnewspodcasts.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
The rebuttal to our conversation with David Sachs over the war in Ukraine. It is the Will Cain Show, streaming live at foxnews.com, on the Fox News YouTube channel, the Fox News Facebook page, and always on demand by subscribing at Apple, Spotify, or on YouTube. I just got a text. It makes me feel much better. I've done this 3 times. 3 times I have done this that I can think of in my life. Maybe 4. Where I have smelled in the air someone, a woman, it's perfume. And I have said, hey, do you mind me asking, what is that perfume? And I ask that question because I want to go purchase it for my wife. In this case, Mother's Day is coming up. And so I thought, hey, that might be a nice gift to get my mom. Now, a lot of people told me, dude, you're definitely walking the HR line. That's kind of creepy. And I'm like, I don't think so. I don't think that's wrong. Well, there is someone at Fox News that I have that I recently asked, hey, what's that perfume you're wearing? And she told me the name of the perfume, and I forgot. So I texted them over the weekend. I said, hey, one more time, what was that perfume? And I didn't get a response for 2 days. And so Hegseth on Fox News Weekend said, oh, man, you are totally toast. Welcome to the email from HR. And I said, it can't be. We can't be in that spot. And I just got the text, hey, sorry, I didn't have this work phone with me over the weekend. It's YSL Libre. Awesome. Thank you. I will be on the lookout before Mother's Day. So I think that I'm in the safe zone. I think that's an okay thing to ask. I'm going to hold firm here. It's okay to ask, hey, what is that perfume? Last week here on the Will Cain Show, we had tech venture capitalist, former COO of PayPal, David Sachs, to talk about, and I played devil's advocate with his position on Ukraine. He said this.
You know, when you actually start to examine the case for Putin being an aggressor, it really falls apart. Now, in terms of the Russians wanting a sphere of influence in their backyard, I suppose that there's some truth to that, but that doesn't mean Russian domination of these countries in the manner of the Soviet Union. What was Russia looking for in Ukraine? They were looking for neutrality. They simply wanted Ukraine to remain neutral.
So that was what David Sachs said in an hour-long discussion last week here on the Will Cain Show. That clip made its way on to X, and it received a ton of pushback from both the left and the right. There are many people that didn't appreciate that particular point, and maybe not even his point of view, and maybe not even him being platformed here on the Will Cain Show. Rebeccah Heinrichs of the Hudson Institute tweeted this in response to that clip. She said, what a tragic disaster that this guy got a platform with otherwise thoughtful people. I said in response to Rebeccah, why don't you come on and lay out your point of view instead of criticizing the fact that he was platformed? So I'm grateful that she accepted that invitation, because joining us now is Rebeccah Heinrichs, a senior fellow and director of Keystone Defense Initiative at the Hudson Institute, who joins us now. Well, thank you for being here, Rebeccah.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So let's start with sort of what I had to say to you on X. I think it's necessary for me, if I'm being real and authentic, to sort of clear the air. What I did not like about your response, Rebeccah, was that I thought that you were sort of adopting the language and the positions of so many on the left that if you encounter something you disagree with, then that whole point of view shouldn't have been platformed. And you used the word platform. And I really didn't appreciate that you thought it was wrong for me to have that conversation with David Sachs.
So that's not what I meant, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. What I was expressing was a frustration that David Sachs, who is welcome to have a different view about the wisdom of U.S. policy on this or that foreign policy issue, but that he would say something, make such an egregious claim that Russia is in fact not the aggressor in this situation, but that Sachs has really gained a very prominent, when I say platform, I don't mean that he's allowed to speak. I mean that he has an elevated opportunity to speak into, especially, I'm a conservative, and especially to right-winger conservative viewers, and is pushing, in fact, things that are false. And so I was lamenting that this had sort of gotten into the bloodstream of right-wing media or of conservative media. But I mean, I disagree with people all the time. I welcome debate and discussion. And so I'm not at all pushing away this notion that we can't listen to different viewpoints. People can have different viewpoints. But that's another thing when you're actually pushing something that is morally confused or just factually wrong, which is what I was lamenting in the case of David Sachs's view that Russia was in fact arguably, credibly arguing that Russia was not the aggressor versus Ukraine.
Okay, I appreciate that. Just a couple of quick questions, and then I think we should address the issues that he brought up. And these aren't gotcha. I'm genuinely curious. When you saw that tweet, did you watch the video clip of what he had to say?
Yeah, I mean, I watched that
caption?
clip. I watched the clip that was pushed on. I did not watch the hour-long interview of Sachs. I have been casually watching Sachs's views on the issue, especially leading up to the supplemental, the big national security supplemental. I've been watching what he's been saying because then I've been busy trying to make sure that people understood what was real and what was not, to educate the conversation a little bit better. But I did not watch the hour-long interview.
That was my second question. So I appreciate you clarifying that. The reason I ask you that is I feel like that a lot of people who, and I got a lot of pushback from people that otherwise I think agree with me on many issues, took particular exception to that one line, that the case for Putin as an aggressor falls apart. I think without listening to his explanation, or more importantly, probably listening to the entire conversation where I played devil's advocate to some extent, but I'm sure for someone of your particular point of view, I would have failed to adequately play devil's advocate. But I should tell you, I think two things at the outset. One, I do think David Sachs is very thoughtful and smart. That doesn't make him right on everything, but I think that his point of view is one that is worthy of consideration. Second, I think that in the bloodstream of conservatism right now, there is not a monolithic position, certainly in support of the U.S.'s continued funding of the war in Ukraine. And there's a great amount of skepticism for a variety of reasons, which we can discuss, about whether or not this is wise. So this is in the bloodstream, and this needs to be discussed. Now, his case in particular, the one that made everybody mad, that Putin isn't the aggressor, he says the case for Putin as the aggressor falls apart. He made the case to me, Rebeccah, that the West was the provocateur, in essence, by flirting with NATO for Ukraine, continuing to grow NATO's presence to the east, and making Putin insecure about what has been a historical sphere of influence. I told him, look, hey, Putin's got clear motivations. He wants that sphere of influence across Eastern Europe. Now, whether or not that's in response to history, or whether or not that's in response to current, growth of the West and NATO towards his borders, or whether or not that's an offensive move on his behalf to reestablish some kind of imperial control, is the debate. But Sachs makes the question that he's not looking to roll tanks like Hitler through Poland. He's just looking to defend his sphere of influence from NATO's growth.
Right. And I would just say that that particular perspective would have to ignore, I think, the chain of events that happened from the NATO Founding Act, and even really before that. I mean, Gorbachev himself said that there was no discussion about the enlargement of NATO when East and West Germany were unified. That now Gorbachev makes a sort of an argument. He made an argument that it was implied that NATO would not expand militarily, but that was not initially part of the discussion. Now you fast forward to 1997, the NATO Founding Act. And the United States worked with our NATO allies, worked really hard to come up with security understandings to satisfy Russia's, I would argue, paranoia about NATO's threat to Russia. And so anytime the United States and NATO, with NATO, began discussions with other countries to bring them into the alliance, and they had to ask, and they were welcomed in if they met certain requirements, that at the same time, in parallel, there was always security consultations with the Russians. And that was certainly true in 1997 with the NATO Founding Act. Now, when I worked on Capitol Hill in the 2005, 2006, 2007, I mean, at the time, the big issue with the Russians was, the Bush administration wanted to put a missile defense system in Europe. And the Russians, threw a fit about that. It was a defensive system against the Iranians. And again, we dealt with the same thing, Russian paranoia, military systems in Europe. And again, I watched the U.S. government work really hard to have these conversations with the Russians to demonstrate that Europe, that NATO posed no offensive threat to the Russians. And they would continue, the Russians would throw up this complaint. And we can go back and forth. And every time this would happen, these were defensive systems, posed no threat to Russia. The Obama administration, this is my final point before you can kind of get me into your next question. It was the Obama administration that tried really hard. I mean, remember Russia Reset? And this was a series of issues that the Obama administration really laid out and tried to appease the Russians, withdrew the Bush administration plan for that missile defense system, and did a series of other things. Remember the pictures of Medvedev, the Russian president, eating cheeseburgers with Barack Obama, et cetera. And things were in a better place sort of diplomatically with the Russians. And so we've gone back and forth with this on this issue with security agreements. And so I find it really amazing that David Sacks would continue to put forward this idea that the Europeans pose some sort of offensive aggressive threat to the Russians, when just the historical record over and over again was NATO and the United States in particular, I think, bending over backwards to appease the Russians, and the Russians responding with more aggression and provocations.
Well, you know, I'm going to do with you the same thing I did with David Sacks, which to play devil's advocate to some degree, at the risk of being called a Putin puppet or something like that. And by the way, Rebeccah, I think that's another thing that undercuts much of the argument from your side of this issue is the constant ad hominem attacks and censorship. I'm not accusing you of that as a person. But if you dismiss every person who disagrees, proverbial you, as a Putin apologist or a Putin puppet, or in the worst cases censor them off the internet, it really does belie, in my estimation, a weak argument. It creates more skepticism. It makes me look at the issue sideways.
No, first of all, I want to say too, I completely recognize, and this is where I push back hard on those who make that argument that this is Russia, that every disagreement is Russian disinformation, or I mean, especially on with the Democrats. I said, until the Democrats understand that part of the skepticism going on the right on the issue of Russia and Ukraine is due to the Russia hoax. It's due to the weaponization of the intelligence community for political purposes, and especially on the point that the Democrats argued that it was the Russian government that made Donald Trump's legitimate election to the presidency, that they said that was essentially how Trump got elected, and that we're still feeling the effects of that politicalization of the intelligence community. And then you have all these former IC officials who continue to feed that. And so I actually completely recognize the skepticism of that claim, and so it's not the one that I make. I really try to stick with what do we know empirically is true, and what can I bring forward to show skeptical people that no, this is real. Russia poses a threat to the United States and to NATO, and Russia is in fact the aggressor against Ukraine.
I want to come back to the substantive point in just a moment, but one more on this note. The marriage in popular American discourse between Russia and Trump, not just Russia hoax, but the left seeing Putin almost as a proxy for Trump, is also something that breeds skepticism. Like, it explains to me in some way the enthusiasm of the left for something they've never been enthusiastic before, which is sort of like imperial war machine, war in general. I'm shocked that the Ukrainian flag has really stood side by side, literally, with sort of the "in this house" banner, the trans flag, and "in this house, love is love." That the left's enthusiasm for Ukraine is something that I think is tied to their hatred of Trump. But I would ask you, explain to me the passion on the right for this particular war. That's another thing. Oh, you're a Putin apologist and censorship, but I'm also, something that puts my antennas up is why is this such you just said, this is about not just Ukraine, this is about America. This is this existential thing for America. And I've been clear that I don't see very strong America first arguments, and admittedly, that's my prism through which I see issues. Does it serve America first? Not the global hegemony, but America first. I've had trouble with that argument, and so therefore I have trouble with the passion on the right.
So here's why I think that I don't think it's existential at this point. These are my primary assumptions, and this is where this is why whenever I look at somebody like David Sacks and I try to untangle for my own benefit why he's saying what he's saying, and so you try to figure out what are his fundamental assumptions that he believes are true, and then what is his logic that brings him to certain conclusions. So these are my assumptions. Russia has been, if you watch that interview with Putin and with Tucker, which I actually found very helpful, because Putin himself made his case, and he began with Russia's grievances against the West back in all the way the 9th century. So there is something in Putin's mind where he makes claims to Russian peoples and geography that he believes are his, that the United States and other democratic sovereign nations that have existed Borders change over time, but after World War II and then after the Cold War, that are internationally recognized sovereign nations, he makes claims to them erroneously. And his big claim, he hates the United States and the West. I use that word very deliberately. There is a loathing there, and you could see it even in the interview with Tucker. And I actually, found myself just, sympathizing with Tucker as the American, hoping he got out of there safely, out of that interview. Because there is a loathing against the West in the United States for many reasons that I think that go back that, Americans have a hard time appreciating cultures and histories and just a long memory that countries have. But Putin has it. And so my assumption here is what I believe to be true is that Russia is seeking to weaken the United States, not just in Ukraine. It's not just about Ukraine. I mean, I completely reject the idea that it would stop, that Russia would stop if it could just take a piece of Ukraine and be done. That the arguments that Putin makes are about peoples and territory that belong to sovereign democratic nations that are pro-America. The Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, obviously, are just to name a few. And so I believe that it's good for the United States of America if our allies and a major economic area, European continent, where we do conduct lots of trade, is safe, where Americans travel freely, with it, and not, right now, you've got, since the Biden administration has been in power, you've got U.S. embassies withdrawing, you have Americans being held captive in Gaza and elsewhere. It's not a safe place abroad for Americans to be relative to where we even were 4 or 5 years ago. And so, and my belief is that part of U.S. strategy to keep Americans safe here at home is that when our allies are being attacked by shared adversaries, that the best way to keep that conflict away from us is to support our allies and try to help them win that conflict as quickly as possible at the lowest levels of violence so that we don't have horizontal or vertical escalation, meaning a nuclear weapon, or some other, WMD use. And so you want to keep that violence far from us, and you want to keep our allies and our major trading partners in areas safe and stable. And so you can't let adversaries take a little or more because they'll continue to escalate, which is what we've seen with the Biden administration. So I think that the energy comes from.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so I think that the energy comes from those of us. I can just speak for myself. I believe that Russia is a major adversary, a major chronic acute adversary of the United States, and they would seek to harm us in any way they could get away with. And they pick at where those areas where allies and partners they can get away with, and he'll continue to push until he's stopped. And I see him increasingly collaborating with the Chinese. And so, from my perspective, Americans are safer and more prosperous the sooner and more effectively we can get these imperial adversaries back in their box.
Okay, so I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, you've tried to psychoanalyze David Sacks, I asked him to psychoanalyze you. Not you in particular, but I asked him the same thing I asked you. How do you explain the passion for the hawk? His answer to me was that he believes in, he gave a couple of different reasons, but his primary reason was that he believes that again, not you, but the point of view that I think that you do represent sees that the American border does not, end at the Rio Grande or the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean, that it does see the American border as somewhat imperial. Now, this is where we get into, and we're going to do it in a minute with Putin, but we get into sort of an impossible motivational thing to parse. You describe it as trade and friendliness, allies and friendship. And, I think what he would describe it as is more forced imperialism. I said to him, one of the most compelling America First arguments made to me over the importance of Ukraine was, well, we should have control over those minerals, those precious earth, rare resources, and not China and Russia. And he said, why can't we accomplish that through trade? Why does that have to be done through war? And, I think his primary point, though, is it's a view of America not as a nation state, but as a global empire. He's trying to ascertain your motivations, but America as a global empire, maybe utopic in vision, maybe we're the best best person to establish this empire over other alternatives, but he thinks that that's probably what is the driving passion, motivation of people on the left or the right to see this as very important to America, because they see America as a border that extends all the way to the borders of Ukraine. And then when you do that, the criticism would be you forget the issues that are important right here, like our own southern border or our own problems at home as we pour $61 billion or whatever it is now, $95 billion yet in the latest fund over to Ukraine. That you can't do both. You can't, like the Roman Empire, you can't extend the thing all the way through Europe and not take care of what's happening in Rome.
So I want to push back pretty hard on a couple big points. So I'm a conservative internationalist. So I'm very sympathetic to a lot of national conservative arguments that the United States must make a correction away from multilateralism for the sake of itself, back to defending American sovereignty. I've been making that argument very aggressively. I thought that the Trump administration did a great job in many ways at reshoring and reasserting American sovereignty. And so I would disagree. I might disagree with fundamental assumptions with my friends on the left, and I don't want to just sort of monolithically sort of paint them a particular view, but most of them I would say are liberal internationalists, very, very different than what I'm arguing for. I believe that the nation state is the fundamental actor in global affairs. It's not the UN. It's not, you know, it's not some other multilateral organization.
Not NATO.
No, exactly. It's not NATO. NATO is a security alliance. And so made up of sovereign nations that are welcome to join independently. And by the way, you know, I would say in 2001, Putin was asked himself if he would mind if the United States and NATO brought in other members of NATO. And Putin said at the time in 2001 that countries were going to have to make security decisions for themselves. So, you know, there's some counterfactuals to the argument that Putin always perceived NATO as a threat. But I am a huge advocate of the United States getting control of its own border. It must. And so I don't perceive American allies as part of an American empire. They're independent nation states. But they're allies. They benefit the United States. The United States, I mean, they don't belong to us. They act independently. But that the United States is safer when we have independent allies who want a world in which the United States is the strongest power and not a China or a Russia, which do have completely different ideas about how we should conduct trade globally. So this is an important point. I do believe that diplomacy and trade and commerce should always be the norm. That should be sort of the normal tools that we reach for to engage with other countries. But all of them are backed by and empowered by hard power, American military strength, which is only possible by American economic strength. So there's a little bit of, you know, chicken or the egg thing there. But you know, I don't believe in this naive view that we're going to have kind of successful trade in argument, you know, disagreements or agreements with the Chinese if the Chinese are able to simply just push us out of the region, which China is doing it right now. I mean, they're using water cannons against Philippine fishermen all the time in international waters. So, you know, I want the United States of America to be able to move in the world on terms most beneficial to the American people. And we do that when we're the strongest military and economic power.
So this is going longer than I anticipated going, but it's going longer because I want it to go longer. I have a few more areas and I'm enjoying this conversation. So I think Sachs falls short with some level of naivety to think that you can accomplish everything simply through free trade if others on the world stage are disrupting free trade. You know, China's not a free trade player. And if Russia is disrupting your ability to make trade agreements inside of Ukraine, various ways, right? Corruption or election interference, then it makes it impossible for you to play on the field of simple diplomacy and free trade if the other side of the equation is being nefarious. But I also think that you have to acknowledge, I don't think it's naive, I think you have to acknowledge some reality that we're not simply also conducting business as though we are just buddies and friends with all these countries as well. And this is going to lead us back to Putin in just a moment. Like, we have done things, and you could call them defensive or offensive, and welcome to the world, I guess, now of tribal warfare. But have we not interfered in Ukrainian free election? You talked about NATO being a self-reliant, everyone can vote on their own and choose their own path. But it isn't like we played a hands-off role in these countries in influencing the outcomes of their self-determination.
I mean, we'd have to take each case by case basis. I tend to be a little bit skeptical of the notion that it's always some sort of, three-letter agency that's orchestrating, elections in other countries. But I do want to agree with one. I think the thrust of the point.
But don't use always, real quick. Don't use always as an escape hatch. I can't defend always, but I feel pretty safe historically to say, oh yeah, that's definitely happened.
Okay. I mean, that might be true. But I guess what I'm saying, though, is, I mean, but I think it matters. I think sort of broad, we have to be careful, though. I get very sensitive to this idea that the United States has any kind of equivalence historically at all with meddling in elections to the degree of what we see on the level of authoritarian countries. But I will agree with this point that I think it has merit. This particular issue, I think, has merit, which is that I do think that the United States must take a lighter touch inside democratic nations in terms of even what we do in the open, totally above board, in trying to create incentives and disincentives for things on social policy, marriage, abortion, things that irritate the American people, that the Democratic Party and, in fact, the State Department has conflated with what is, quote unquote, American interests. It aggravates conservative countries, and it's completely unhelpful when we're in this contest with the Chinese and the Russians to have countries who would prefer the United States be the strongest power over them. So I want to agree on that point. I mean, what I've argued for is geopolitical pluralism in the free world. But the last thing, Will, I think this is really important. You're sort of, making his point for him in his absence. So if this is not exactly what he thinks, I apologize in advance. But this idea that we can have trade without hard power sufficiently bolstering it, I mean, that is the argument that the liberals have been making for decades that I've been contending with. And it's really the big problem that the U.S. has had since we welcomed China into the WTO. This was Clinton's idea, that we could just replace realities about human beings and countries with just trade. But it's the American Navy, Army, Air Force, Marine Corps that enables the United States to even have safe passage in trade and commerce to begin with. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a fundamental disagreement about what creates a secure and stable environment, even for the most fundamental thing like trade.
So and I'm not doing a semantic thing with you. To be clear, I didn't make the argument that America was equivalent to what China or Russia might be doing on the world stage. But I'm making the argument that America is not pure as the driven snow. And the point of that is not some type of self-hatred. The point of that is to take us back full circle to this conversation where we began. And that is that you made the argument that Putin is paranoid. Now, paranoia implies an irrational belief or an irrational fear. And I think what we've been setting up is it's not about right or wrong. It's about what is. And I think you kind of helped lay out the case that I would make to you when you talked about Putin's interview with Tucker. And I don't think it's just Putin. I think, like you said, it's the Russian people. I think it's people at large have deep cultural memories. And, while you can talk to me about the security arrangements that were attempted to be arranged between, Medvedev and Obama, or whoever it may be throughout time, the broader arc of history shows that Russia's paranoia is kind of well-founded. And this isn't America's the bad guy. That's not the argument. It's like Napoleon marched to Moscow, marched into Russia. Hitler marched right through, Eastern Europe into Russia. 50, what are we looking at? 50, 60, 70 years of a Cold War. There's a reason that and I think you're right, I think he does loathe the West. I think he does loathe America. And I think 50, 60, 70 years of the Cold War, which he grew up in as an agent in the FSB and KGB, show his mindset. But I don't think that suggests it's paranoia. I think it shows somewhat that he is a creature of history and his life. And if he sees then, therefore, if we acknowledge that reality is my point, then if he sees NATO growing west or east, if he sees NATO growing east, if he sees America fiddling in Ukrainian elections, if he sees these different things, he is going to want to protect that sphere of influence. He is going to want to meddle in Latvia. And then we can have an argument about offense versus defense and all that. That's fine. But it is an understanding of who he is and whether or not we need to really be concerned he's going to roll tanks through Poland.
So let me just a couple of pushbacks. One, though, but you can look at reality. You can actually look at the military power in these NATO countries versus the very credible, strong military that the Russians have, not even include, we haven't even talked about their nuclear weapons. They have more nuclear weapons than anybody else in the world. And they use them for nuclear saber rattling. They're at the range of sovereign, democratic, pro-American countries, and they threaten with them all the time. And so if you just look at the reality, though, the empirical facts, we did not place permanent military presence, NATO presence in Poland. We didn't even start putting anything that could resemble anything that looked like serious defensive NATO troops in Poland until Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. And so if you just look at the reality, my argument is the reason that Putin finally chose February 2022 to invade Ukraine is not because your NATO was so strong and threatening, but because it was weak and it was a temptation that he could do it. He thought that he had an American presidency that would not impose a cost sufficient that would make him decide it wasn't worth it, and that's why he did it. And it was because there was a temptation there that it was just too strong for him to turn away from. But so it is smart. It is smart for us to try to understand our adversary as he understands himself. That's to kind of inoculate ourselves from this American mirror imaging that we can fall into, thinking that everybody thinks the way we do. But that's not the same as granting legitimacy to the claims. And that's where I fundamentally reject what Sachs was saying. Russia is quite obviously the aggressor.
Do you think, just real quick on that point, to bolster that, Sachs says he thinks Putin would have been content with neutrality from Ukraine. So your argument is no, he would not have been. He would have seen the weakness from NATO and wanted to take it based upon his historical understanding of either the Soviet Union or the sphere of influence of Russia.
Absolutely. We saw that in the Minsk agreements. Russia never even withdrew their heavy equipment, which was a fundamental requirement of the Minsk agreements. And so, Russia repeatedly and constantly does not abide by agreements and treaties of which it claims to sign up for. And so we've seen it again and again. This is not some global conspiracy that Russia still has imperialistic claims. It's why the intelligence communities of the Baltic countries and of Poland and of the Brits come to the same conclusion that the U.S. government has, which is that Russia is not going to stop unless it's made to stop, which is where, my argument is we should bolster Ukraine's ability to push Russia out and not keep this war a long, protracted war, but should fundamentally shift our strategy to enable Ukraine to push them out. And then, frankly, I'd pull the United States out of the NATO Founding Act. Russia has constantly violated its agreements. And so I think at this point, the United States and NATO have a strong argument that now it's time to bolster, now do the very thing that Putin has claimed that we were going to do, and that which we didn't do for years and years and years, which is now we're going to be strong because weakness clearly provoked the Russians to invade Ukraine in this full scale invasion in 2022. And, my argument is we have no reason to believe Putin would stop, even if he, conquers or subjugates Kyiv, which is still Russia's objective at this point.
Okay, so last two things. I think this first one's not a question. It's more like, let me see if I understand. So, okay, if I grant you all your premises, if I grant you, Putin's motivations, if I grant you a crystal ball of what will happen in the future, an American should care whether or not he reestablishes subjugation of the Baltics. He already has Belarus, of Ukraine. America should care about Russia's relationship to Eastern Europe. You're telling me because America, A, is friends with these countries, and B, we need to protect our trade interest in the free travel of Americans throughout the world that would be inhibited if he reestablishes those, Russia/Soviet empire areas of Eastern Europe.
I could give you more reasons why it's important that the United States abide by our security commitments. We have a security commitment. Estonia is a great pro-American country that's done everything that the United States would want it to do to be a, rule of law, free governing nation that does not want to be subjugated by the Russians. And so I think that the U.S. word and commitment matters. And I think it will have ramifications globally. I think that this does have a cascading effect. If the United States global commitments don't mean anything, I think it'll be a disaster for Americans here at home. So yeah, in general, I think that that's a fair articulation.
I think that's a very fair point to add to what I had to say. So finally, last question: how does this end? I mean, the accusation is it's a forever war that will continue to drain America or rack up more debt for America, while we've already addressed whether or not we ignore our problems at home, something you do not advocate for, obviously. But certainly it's going to cost us a lot of money at a minimum. At a minimum, it's going to cost us a lot of money. So how does this end?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say that one of the silver linings of this terrible tragedy is it has forced the Department of Defense and the Congress to actually start rebuilding our defense industrial base, which has completely atrophied since the end of the Cold War. We were focused on the global war on terror. We were not focused on having the ability to produce lots of weapons in case we had a war with a China or a Russia. So that's an
Real quick, the interesting thing about that is your critics would say that's the point of the whole war. It's a payoff to the military-industrial complex. And it's kind of interesting that your response is, well, that's actually a good thing.
No, my argument is I think that Americans working is good. And I think America's being safe and secure is good. I don't think that the argument is that it's the military-industrial complex that's driving this. I mean, it's been atrophied since the end of the Cold War, and it's been weak. And so even among my populist friends who don't think we should support Ukraine, they've argued, like Senator Vance has argued, we should rebuild our defense industrial base. I think that's a fair, true, good thing, and I fully agree with. But my point, though, is that this war has actually forced us to begin to move in that direction faster than we otherwise would, because we've been naive and had wrong assumptions about sort of the end of history, which I think never happened, of course. We've got countries that contest the United States and don't want us to be the strongest power, China being number one. And so I think, I have no reason to believe that this current administration has the sort of constitution, sort of like lowercase c, to be able to do what is necessary to enable Ukraine to exact cost on Russia to get out of Ukraine. I think it's going to be the next administration. President Trump himself has said that if Russia doesn't take a deal that he would try to strike with Ukraine, that more weapons that Ukraine has, that we would send more weapons to Ukraine than we've ever sent thus far. And so, I'm encouraged that door is open in a potential next Trump administration. So, Ukraine is going to be, it has to be allowed to hit Russian oil and gas. It has to be able to do things so that it can convince the Russians they're not going to succeed. And I think that's how this ends. And then I think in order to make sure that Russia doesn't try this again in a couple of years, you're going to have to make those Baltic countries stronger, make Poland stronger, and you're going to have to move what used to be the front of NATO, thinking of Germany. It's now these Eastern and Central European countries. And so NATO has to adapt. And that's how I see that we get to the end of this. And then you're going to have strong, stable European countries that can help us with the China problem. But they're not going to be able to help us with the China problem if there's just constant instability and warfare in the European continent.
All right, listen, very, very thoughtful. It's going to give me a lot to think about, truly. So I'm glad to be not just exposed, but interact with your point of view on this. I am somewhat of a skeptic on the motivations and the interest for America in this war, but I'm very appreciative of the ability to have this interaction. And I think for anybody watching and listening, I think it's going to be valuable for them as well, whether or not they agree or disagree. So I appreciate you being willing to do this and hanging out for so long and talking with me.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. One last thing, none of our problems here at home are going to be made any better if the world continues to fall apart. And it really began with the U.S.'s, precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan. So, we got to close our border. But man, the biggest demographic of people coming across the border right now illegally are Chinese nationals. And so a lot of these problems that the United States is having with our adversaries abroad, they are bleeding into really close to home problems here at home. So we got to do both.
All right, Rebeccah Heinrichs of the Hudson Institute, Senior Fellow and Director of the Keystone Defense Initiative. Thank you so much for doing the Will Cain Show.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, take care. Here we go. That was a long episode today. I didn't expect it to go that long, but I'll admit a personal level of indulgence there on both of those conversations with Hotep Jesus and Rebeccah Heinrichs. I don't know. Give me a lot to think about, something to consider. I hope for you as well. Leave a comment underneath. In fact, let's review some of your comments tomorrow about both of these conversations on YouTube, on X, on Instagram. Follow The Will Cain Show. I'll see you again next time.